Some rescues don't start with sirens, they begin with a quiet decision to stop walking past. Harrison Ford didn't know her name, just a mother, a child, and an old car parked too long in the cold. But something about that night, about the silence between her coughs and the baby's faint cry, made him turn around. And that choice would change 3 lives forever. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe for more. The night air in Santa Monica carried a chill that didn't belong to California. It had rained earlier, and the pavement still glistened under the dim parking lot lights. Harrison Ford stepped out of the small organic market, a simple paper bag in one hand. He wore an old leather jacket, the same one he'd had for years, and a black knit beanie pulled low over his forehead. The world knew his face, but tonight he moved like any man who just wanted to disappear into the quiet. He had just finished a closed-door meeting with a conservation group. Nothing flashy, no press, just ideas and commitments. That's how he liked it. Real work didn't need applause. He made his way through the lot slowly, his boots pressing softly on the wet ground. It was late. Most cars were gone, but then he heard it. A cough, not close, not loud, but hollow, ragged, from somewhere deeper in the lot. His eyes shifted, scanning past the row of neatly parked sedans until they found it, a worn-out station wagon tucked far in the corner. The kind that didn't belong in a place like this. Its windows were fogged over. Clothes were strung along the backseat windows like makeshift curtains, swaying just slightly in the breeze. And then, movement. A figure, small, fragile. A woman pushing a shopping cart half empty. Her steps were uneven, like she hadn't slept in days. She kept her head low, eyes darting from side to side. Her coat was 2 sizes too big, and her shoes didn't match. She passed 2 young men exiting the store. One of them looked at her, smirked, and muttered just loud enough, "Trash like that shouldn't be hanging around here." Harrison stopped walking. He didn't say anything, just turned his gaze slowly toward them, then back to the woman. She was trying not to be seen, trying to shrink into the air. She moved to the far corner of the lot and opened the driver's side door of the old car. That's when Harrison noticed it. A shape, wrapped in mismatched blankets in her arms, tiny. Squirming, a baby, he stood still. The parking lot faded. The lights seemed too bright now, the silence too loud. She crawled into the front seat and gently closed the door. Her head dropped, forehead resting on the steering wheel. The car's tailpipe puffed white smoke in the cold, struggling to keep the inside warm. He didn't move. For a few seconds, he just watched. Then he turned, walked to his own truck, opened the door, but before getting in, he glanced back once more. Through the foggy glass, he could still see the outline of her cradling the baby, both of them shivering in the dim yellow light. He didn't start the engine right away. He sat in the driver's seat, hands on the wheel, staring forward. He'd seen things like this before, on the road, in towns nobody cared to name, in cities too loud to notice the silent. But this time, something felt different. Maybe it was the baby. Maybe it was the way the woman kept looking over her shoulder, as if the world was hunting her down. Maybe it was just time. He whispered to the quiet around him. "This isn't the first time I've seen it." He took a breath, but this time, "I'm not walking away." Morning broke quietly over Santa Monica. The sky was pale and flat, with a faint breeze rustling through the palm trees lining the nearly empty lot. The world was already beginning to move, delivery trucks backing in, coffee shops flickering to life. But in the far corner of that same parking lot, the old station wagon hadn't moved an inch. Harrison Ford pulled into the lot behind the wheel of his dusty old pickup, the kind of vehicle no one would look at twice. His jacket was the same worn leather, his knit cap pulled low. He parked in a far row, away from the rest, and sat there for a moment. The same car, the same fogged windows, a bundle of blankets still visible through the misted glass. He reached to the passenger seat and picked up the things he had brought from home, a folded wool blanket, a sealed canister of powdered formula, a large bottle of spring water. He looked at them in silence. There was no note, no name. He didn't think it was needed. Then, quietly, he got out. His steps were steady, not rushed. He crossed the lot without drawing attention, walking with the kind of ease that comes from years of doing without being seen. No one noticed, except the man in the security uniform leaning against a nearby wall. As Harrison reached the car, he placed the items gently on the hood, positioned so they would be noticed, but not mistaken for trash. The moment he turned to walk away, the voice cut through the air. "Hey, you can't just leave things like that." It was the security guard, late 30s, new uniform, loud. Harrison paused mid-step, turned his head slightly and simply nodded. "Got it," he said quietly. Then he kept walking. He didn't explain, didn't argue. He returned to his truck, climbed in, and started the engine. But he didn't leave right away. From the rearview mirror he watched. A few minutes passed. The car door creaked open. The woman stepped out slowly, clutching her coat tight around her. Her face was drawn, eyes heavy from a sleepless night. She didn't look around, just walked to the front of the car. Her eyes landed on the bundle of items. She froze. At first, her hand moved quickly, angrily, to swipe it away. She grabbed the blanket, lifted it, as if ready to throw it off the hood. But something stopped her. Her fingers brushed against the pack of wipes tucked beside the formula. She looked down. It was already opened. A few wipes had been pulled from the package, pre-folded, ready to use. Her hand trembled. She glanced around the lot, scanning the cars, the shadows, the empty air. But there was no one. Just a few distant sounds, the hum of traffic, a seagull overhead, and the soft clink of a bottle shifting inside the bag. She lowered the blanket, took the wipes, then the formula, and finally the water. Her eyes lingered for a moment on the wool blanket, as if unsure whether she deserved it. Then she wrapped it around herself and went back inside the car, closing the door without a sound. From his truck, Harrison watched as the condensation on the windshield shifted slightly. The silhouette inside moved gently, rocking. The baby must have stirred. He took a breath, shifted into gear, and drove away. No speeches, no questions. He had done something, but deep down, it didn't feel like enough. The sun was beginning to fall, casting long amber streaks across the pavement. The parking lot had thinned again. Rush hour had passed, and the store lights flickered as the night crept closer. Harrison Ford sat in his truck, parked at a distance. He had been watching quietly for the last 10 minutes. The car was still there, still fogged, still silent. Then he saw her. The woman stepped out, cradling the baby against her chest. She moved with a tremble, her coat pulled tight around both of them. The child was coughing, deep, dry coughs that didn't belong to someone so small. She walked toward the side of the lot where the wind hit strongest, shielding the baby with her body. Her shoes scraped the concrete, uneven and slow. Harrison stepped out of the truck. He didn't walk fast, didn't rush. Just made his way over, hands in his pockets. His voice, when he spoke, was low and steady. "I saw you the other night." She didn't look at him. Her eyes were locked on the baby in her arms, adjusting the blanket, trying to keep the little hands warm. "I don't need anything from you," she said, her tone sharp, tired, but not angry, just done. "I know," he replied. Then, with a quiet motion, he sat down on the low concrete curb beside her car. No sudden movements. No urgency. He opened a small cloth bag he had brought and pulled out a sealed bottle of baby formula, gently placing it next to his boot. Then a soft pacifier, still in its package. Finally, a small stuffed animal, a weathered fox, clearly old but clean. "It's for him," he said, not looking at her. She stood still for a moment, the baby still coughing in her arms. Her fingers gripped tighter. The wind picked up. Her hair whipped across her face, and when she finally turned her head slightly, her eyes shimmered, not from tears, not yet, but from the kind of fatigue that doesn't sleep off. "I'm not begging," she whispered. Harrison didn't move. "I didn't say you were." The baby started to cry, not a whimper, a full-throated wail that pierced the quiet evening air. She rocked him gently, but her arms began to shake. Her knees wobbled, and suddenly she crouched down beside the car, pressing her forehead to the cold door frame. Her voice cracked. "He needs milk," she said. I need milk, but I'm not asking." He turned his head slowly, just enough to see her. "I didn't ask you to." She looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time her face showed more than weariness. There was something underneath, anger, shame, and behind all that fear. "I'm not weak," she said. "No," he replied, "you're not." A long pause, then without another word she reached for the bottle of formula. Her hands were shaking. She clutched it tightly, as if afraid it would vanish. Her fingers brushed the stuffed fox, but she didn't take it, not yet. She stood and turned to open the car door, holding the formula like it was made of glass. As she stepped inside, the baby still sobbing against her chest, something unexpected happened. A small hand reached out from under the blanket, and it touched Harrison's, just for a second. Tiny fingers curled around two of his breath caught. She didn't see it. She was too busy calming the baby, too busy avoiding his eyes. But Harrison sat there, unmoving, that small handprint lingering on his skin like something ancient and true. When she finally got into the car and closed the door, he remained on the curb. The wind rustled through the empty lot. The fox toy sat beside him. He looked at it, then at the car. He didn't smile, he didn't speak, but something in his eyes shifted. A decision had been made, and this time he wasn't leaving it there. The wind picked up as the last shoppers trickled out of the store. Most of the lot had gone dark, the overhead lamps flickering one by one, leaving long stretches of shadow between the pools of light. Harrison Ford stood beside the old car once again, this time without waiting. He placed a cloth tote carefully on the hood, another blanket, some clean towels, a fresh package of diapers, and tucked between them, a folded note. He didn't linger. He turned and walked back toward his truck, the heels of his boots clicking softly against the asphalt. The lot was quiet, except for the low hum of the city in the distance and the restless rattle of wind pressing through the trees. Then came the voice, sharp, raw behind him. "Hey, wait." Harrison stopped. He turned slowly just as she emerged from the car. Her steps were quick, uneven. The child wasn't in her arms, just her, alone. She held the tote bag in her hand and threw it to the ground between them. The items tumbled out, blanket, diapers, the note fluttering slightly in the breeze. "I'm not a charity case," she said. Her voice was steady, but her breathing was all over the place. "I'm not some broken thing you fix with leftovers." Harrison looked at her, not the bag, not the ground, just her. "You didn't ask for anything," he said quietly. "I offered." Her arms were crossed now, defensive, but he could see they were trembling. Her fingers dug into the sleeves of her coat. "I don't want your pity," she added, her voice rising, but the edge was duller than before. Worn down by exhaustion more than pride. "This isn't pity," he said. "It's a blanket. It's a towel. It's what anyone would want if they were cold." She shook her head, a bitter laugh slipping out. "Anyone? You think anyone ends up here by choice?" "No," Harrison said, "I don't." She opened her mouth to say more, but then stopped. Her chest rose and fell, her lips pressed tightly together. For a moment, she looked like she might scream. Instead, she broke. Her arms dropped to her sides. She looked down at the spilled items, then back at him. "I used to have a house," she said suddenly. Her voice was different now, not angry, not even tired, just hollow. "I had a husband, a front porch, a garden with stupid sunflowers that never grew straight." She paused. "I used to sit out there with my coffee and think about stupid things, like maybe we'd paint the fence, or get a dog." Harrison didn't move. "I was someone else back then," she said, "and now I'm this." Her eyes were wet, but no tears fell. She didn't want them to. She was fighting to hold something together that had already broken long ago. "I'm not looking for sympathy," she added, softer now. I don't know how I got from there to here." The wind blew the note across the ground. It stopped near Harrison's boot. He bent slowly and picked it up, unfolded it, and glanced at the words he had written just hours ago. "No one deserves to be out here, shaking in the cold," he read aloud. Then he looked at her again. "And I meant it." For a long time, they said nothing. Then she knelt, quietly gathering the things she had thrown, one by one, no apology, no thanks, just silence. Harrison turned to leave, but this time she didn't watch him go. She looked down at the small stuffed fox still nestled in the tote bag. Her hand hovered over it, then closed around it like something fragile and familiar. She stood alone in the fading light, the wind swirling around her, and whispered to herself, barely audible, "I used to have a name." The night had settled heavy around them. Most of the lot was dark now, just one overhead lamp flickering weakly above the far corner where the old station wagon sat. The soft hum of passing traffic blurred in the distance, and somewhere nearby, a radio played faintly behind the walls of a closed storefront. Emily sat on the curb beside her car, the baby curled against her chest, finally asleep. A thin blanket covered them both, and the stuffed fox lay between her side and the baby's small hand. Her eyes were hollow, ringed with sleepless nights, but she didn't seem tired anymore. Just quiet. Harrison Ford sat a few feet away, his elbows resting on his knees, head slightly bowed. Neither of them spoke for a while. There was no need to. The silence was the kind that says more than small talk ever could. Then, softly, Emily spoke. He was supposed to be home by 7, just a regular night. Her voice was almost lost in the wind. My husband, Liam, he worked construction, nothing dangerous, nothing exciting. He was careful, always was. She looked down at the sleeping child in her arms. That night it rained. Some kid ran a red light, hit him head on. She took a shaky breath. They said he didn't suffer, that it was quick, but that doesn't mean anything, does it? Quick or slow, he's still gone. Harrison didn't interrupt. He just listened. I didn't even cry at first. I just stood there, holding the envelope with his name on it. Felt like someone else's life, not mine. She shifted, tucking the blanket more tightly around the baby. His parents were kind at the start. Kind in the way people are when they think you'll break. Brought casseroles, cleaned the kitchen, said things like, "You'll be okay." Her tone turned sharper now, not angry, just edged. Then they started saying I wasn't stable, that I was too emotional to raise a child, that Oliver deserved better, that Liam wouldn't have wanted this life for him. Her fingers clutched the blanket tighter. I tried to fight back, but I didn't have money for a lawyer. I had bills, diapers, funeral costs. Everything felt like a wall closing in. She looked up, meeting Harrison's gaze for the first time. I packed the car one night and left. No plan, just away. Harrison's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes stirred. I ended up in Nevada first, found a cafe job, took cash under the table, thought I'd finally breathe again. Emily gave a short, bitter laugh. A man used to come in, said I looked tired, said I smiled nice. One day he grabbed me, just for a second, but I slapped him. She paused. I got fired that night. The baby shifted slightly in her arms, letting out a tiny whimper before settling back to sleep. I tried applying everywhere, office cleaning, gas stations, but you can't bring a baby to a job interview. They look at you like you're a problem before you even speak. Her voice dropped lower. I started parking where no one would notice, lot hopping, grocery stores, truck stops, always moving before someone knocks. She swallowed hard. I tried not to think about what I'd become, just focused on Oliver, kept telling myself I just needed one good break, one person to take a chance. She looked down again. One night, back in Arizona, they almost took him. Her voice cracked. CPS found us in a Walmart lot. Someone called in a complaint. They said the baby looked hungry, cold. Tears welled, but she blinked them back. They said they could place him temporarily, just for his safety. Asked me to sign a form. She went quiet. The wind filled the space between them. I begged them not to take him. I got on my knees in the parking lot, cried like I never thought I could, said I'd leave the state that night. They gave me 48 hours to disappear. She brushed her thumb along Oliver's tiny cheek, so I ran. Harrison didn't speak right away. He sat in that quiet way of his, letting her words settle. When he finally spoke, it wasn't loud, just enough. I know what it's like to be pushed out, to feel like every door's been locked behind you. He paused. I was told once I didn't belong in the rooms I walked into, that I was too rough, too stubborn, too much. He looked at her gently, but I didn't leave the world, and you shouldn't either. Emily stared at the ground, her lips parted like she wanted to say something more, but instead she nodded, just once. And in that nod was something heavier than grief. It was the beginning of trust. The morning light was soft, almost kind. A thin layer of mist still hung low along the sidewalks, and the air held that quiet stillness only early hours know. Harrison pulled his truck into a narrow driveway behind a small motel. It wasn't fancy, just a row of single-story rooms, a flickering vacancy sign, and a night guard sipping coffee by the front office. But it was clean, quiet, safe. Emily sat in the passenger seat, holding Oliver close. The baby stirred slightly but didn't cry. He was warm for once, wrapped in a real blanket, belly full. Emily hadn't said much during the drive. She looked out the window most of the time, as if trying to prepare herself for whatever this was going to be. Harrison parked near the end of the row and stepped out first. He walked around and opened her door gently. "This one's yours." "Room 9. She hesitated before stepping out. The baby whimpered once, then nestled closer to her chest. Harrison handed her an envelope. Inside was a key, a small amount of cash, and a handwritten note. She opened it slowly. "Not forever," the note read. "Just a place to breathe, temporary peace. You deserve at least that." She didn't say anything, just stared at the paper. Her eyes lingered on the word peace like it was foreign. Then she looked up. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He met her eyes. "Because I can," he said simply, "and because it's the right thing." She nodded once, too tired to argue. He helped her carry a small bag into the room. It was basic but warm. A clean bed, a private bathroom, the heater already humming softly. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking it in, as if unsure whether she was allowed to step further. Oliver let out a soft laugh in his sleep. It was the first sound of joy she had heard from him in weeks. Later that day, Harrison sat in his truck, parked outside a small non-profit office across town. He made a call to an old friend, someone he hadn't seen in years, a woman who had once run emergency medical teams with him on the side of a mountain. Now she ran something different. "Women on their feet," she said when she picked up. "Still standing, barely. What do you need?" "I've got someone," Harrison said. "Single mother, no support, no money, trying to survive in the corner of a parking lot. Her name, Emily, and she's got a baby who deserves better." There was a pause on the line, then came the voice. "Harrison, you remember that hiker you pulled off that cliff back in Idaho?" He didn't answer. "I watched the footage. You didn't hesitate. You got lowered by rope into a storm because you couldn't stand the idea of someone slipping through the cracks." Her voice softened. "This woman, she's falling, just slower, and nobody's looking." Harrison looked out the windshield, back toward the motel in the distance. "She needs 4 weeks," he said. "Somewhere to land. I'll cover whatever it takes." "We'll take her," the woman replied. "Send her my way." As the sun began to dip again, Harrison returned to the motel. Emily opened the door before he knocked. She looked different somehow, still tired, still cautious, but her shoulders were lower, the lines around her mouth softer. "There's a place," he told her. "Not forever, just enough time to figure out the next step. You in?" She didn't speak at first, just looked down at Oliver, now fully awake, playing with the fox toy on the bed. Then she nodded. And for the first time, not out of fear, out of choice, 3 weeks passed like a slow breath, not fast, not loud, just enough to remind everyone that healing isn't dramatic, it's quiet. Emily had settled into a rhythm. A small part-time job at a local office where the manager knew not to ask too many questions. Mornings came with structure now. Oliver had a spot at a nearby daycare, paid for by a grant from the center Harrison had connected her with. The days were still hard, but they were hers. That mattered more than she could explain. Harrison didn't visit often, just once a week. He'd knock, bring groceries, or sit in silence if that's all the day allowed. Sometimes he stayed in the truck and waved. Emily never asked for more, and he never pushed. On a Thursday afternoon, the sky was a dusty blue, and the wind carried the scent of rain that never came. Harrison pulled up and stepped out of his truck with a paper bag of apples and canned soup. Emily met him halfway, holding a folded piece of paper in her hand. "It's from Oliver," she said. She handed it to him without ceremony, without build-up. He took it gently, a piece of construction paper, crayon smudged. The lines were wild but full of intent. A big figure wearing a round hat stood next to something with wide wings. A bird next to both, a smaller figure, stick arms, big smile. "He drew this at daycare," Emily said, watching him. Harrison didn't say anything. He kept staring at the picture. "That's you," she added softly, "and that's the hawk." He looked up, the hawk. Yeah, she said. I didn't even know he remembered, but he said you're the man who flies, and that you brought the bird that watches over him. Harrison blinked slowly. Years ago, he had rescued an injured hawk in the hills of Wyoming. He'd flown it himself to a wildlife sanctuary. No press, no photos, just a quiet moment between a man and a creature that still had fight in it. He had mentioned it once, offhand, while Emily was half asleep feeding Oliver. He didn't think she heard, didn't think it mattered, but somehow it had made its way into the boy's world. He folded the picture carefully. Thank him for me, he said. Emily smiled. He thinks you're a superhero. I'm not. I know, she said. That's probably why it works. They stood for a while in the soft light, not speaking. Then Emily broke the silence. I don't know how to repay this. You already are. She looked at him. By showing up, he said. By standing back up. Every day you choose not to give up, you're paying it forward. Emily swallowed hard. I want to help someone else someday, she said, like you helped me. Then you will. A child's laugh rang out from behind them. Oliver stood at the door with the fox toy in hand, waving. His face was clean, his hair combed. He looked like a child who belonged somewhere. Emily turned to go inside, but Harrison lingered. He looked down at the drawing once more, at the way the boy had drawn the sky, full of color, full of space. He thought about all the times he'd flown solo, trusting only the compass and the wind. And then he said, almost to himself, I used to think the best thing I could do was fly the plane in the right direction. He looked toward the door, where Oliver was now tugging gently at Emily's coat, asking for snacks. But maybe, he continued, just sitting down next to someone when it matters, maybe that's enough. He slipped the drawing into the pocket of his jacket. He didn't need a thank you. He already had what he came for, a quiet moment, a changed life, and a crayon sky where someone believed he had wings. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.